So I'm going to look at, try and focus in more on the graveyards. Again, I'll go over one or two issues to do with other monument types, just by way of illustrating issues that can come up with conservation of any of these things. But I was asked to do something on maintenance and good practice for the cleaning and clearing of monuments. And when I looked at that word clearing, I thought, oh, we need to qualify that a little bit. It's to do with less heavy machinery and more elbow grease generally. So we're looking at, primarily when it comes to maintaining historic graveyards, is dealing with vegetation. And whether that's maintaining it at a level where you can deal with it, or more in-depth removal, which I'll illustrate to you later on. That's the thing that really most community groups should be engaged with on an ongoing basis, and you can occasionally bring in help for that, as I can illustrate later on. I'll just continue where John gave a very comprehensive introduction and told you all the other reference points to find information on monument types around the country. And this, I just chose this illustration because it's a very prominent part of the scenery, but you can just see where this circular formation here, probably the remnants of an Iron Age ring fort, is part of a wider tapestry of field boundaries that have probably changed in their nature, their size, their quantity over time as different livestock have become the main part of the local farming community, or tillage regimes, and it's just to show that monuments aren't an individual isolated feature. They're part of a wider landscape. Much of this landscape, the streams and the field boundaries and the coastline and other matters there, they're not part of the protected monument, but they form part of its context, so it's important to bear them in mind. I'll briefly then go over some more of the field monuments, and again this is a shot from the historic monument or historic environment viewer that John was explaining to you earlier. This is in County Roscommon. It's an area known as Rathcrone, which many of you may be familiar with as being the focus of it. It's a royal site, the focus of where Queen Maeve and the various epics to do with the Taun mythological stories and the brown bull and various things like that. But all of this literary heritage originated from a small area of limestone-based land, limestone-based natural grassland, which is surrounded by an area of, you see, extensive wet, boggy conditions. So there was another, this work is something we were involved in up until recently, to do with helping farmers to manage archaeologically rich landscapes. And there was one particular map I saw that had kind of cattle population on Ireland, and there's a big red area around Cork, Tipperary, Wexford, the southeast and west, Limerick, and then there's decreasingly fewer numbers of cattle as you go northwest, mainly due to the state of the land. But there's one little island here between sort of Tulsk and Ballahadreen in County Roscommon, where the free draining limestone landscape has enabled grazing of cattle there for centuries. So zooming further into the historic environment viewer there and onto the satellite image, we're just able to look at a couple of archaeological features, and there's numerous archaeological evidence around here. You can see again these red dots and the crop marks on the grass, where below ground there's possibly nothing to be seen on the surface, not even an undulation in many cases, but in certain dry years where disturbed ground produces different performance of the grass that grows on it, you can see all these items. There are lines and various things going on all through this landscape, showing continuous habitation and alteration of the landscape over time. But what I'm going to look at is these pairs of parallel raised ditches of earth, and these are known as the Mukhlis. They're a relatively unclassifiable archaeological monument. It's very much open to debate what their purpose or role was originally, but it would appear that they are some sort of a ceremonial upstanding earthwork. That's usually code for we don't have a baldy, what they are. But I've taken the next photograph standing up here and looking down through the parallel lines of this feature. So you can see it's on a relatively intensively managed grazing area. So there's a lot of farming activity here. Very little scrub has built up due to lack of farming activity. But with that, and with changing agricultural practices, cattle getting more numerous and larger and kept in for most of the winter, there are pressures now that are coming onto these monuments, which have survived being in a cattle grazing area for, upwards of 1,000-2,000 years, and they're now starting to experience pressure that wouldn't have happened up until recently. And you can see these areas here of exposed earth where cattle instinctively will nose and rub at the earth, particularly on the south elevations of the feature, and that leads to erosion. And like most conservation, there's a question here: how do you go about preventing that? How do you go about dealing with it or remedying it? You have to consider that it is in an active agricultural zone. You could fence it off, keep the animals off it, but then their grazing helps to prevent the development of scrub trees and things growing on the monument, which over time could cause damage too. So yeah, you have to come up with some sort of a pertinent means of dealing with those issues. But again, these, as John was saying, they're mostly on private land and not really what a lot of community groups are likely to be dealing with. That's another. It's not terribly clear. I wonder, would closing this curtain help? I don't really know whether it would make it any clearer. I hate closing out the sunlight, but anyway, if it's basically a circular ring fort again, bisected by a hedge and a fence going right through it, which divides two neighbouring landowners, and it was really just to illustrate the different effects that the differing intensity of farming practices can have on the earthworks. So here you've got native hawthorn propagating itself on the earthwork, which is good from a wildlife and pollinator point of view, but creates areas where animals tend to shelter and congregate and cause erosion to the cultural heritage. And like one suggested means of helping to alleviate this is maybe, under care, remove the hawthorn from here, but plant 600 along this hedgerow. Probably part of a later historic field boundary, or possibly a townland or parish boundary. So that's helping to reinforce that boundary and providing the shelter and the natural heritage benefit that the trees can bring, whilst alleviating pressure on the monument. So this is just on the other side of the fence. You can see much more fencing, greener grass, so a bit more fertilizer, and a bit more intensively managed. In which case, there's no scrub now growing on this side of the earthwork, but there's increased erosion from having more cattle there. Cattle get bored, and that's what they do. They poke at the ground. So there are other potential solutions to that, but again, they're not so closely related to the graveyards that I want to get onto later. This is actually a ring fort, Rathnadarv, in state ownership, but managed by neighbouring farmers, and you can just see the level of erosion and issues caused by the necessary keeping of cattle, which have got a lot larger and a lot more hungry in the last few decades as a result of changing farming practices. You've also got the insertion of a public road, probably built there as part of a drainage scheme, you know, in the last 100 years or so. Not an ancient way, but put right alongside an extensive circular monument, and that could be contributing to drainage issues around the area. So lots of things, and this will come up in measures to do with graveyards and other things that you may be involved with. Everything has consequences. They might not, every action you take, it might look fine for a week or a year or 5 or 10 years, but you have to be mindful of possible changes that could be wrought by interventions that you make down the line, that may outweigh the benefit that you get from those actions in the shorter term. So you need to be aware of that, and it reinforces the importance of having a plan and reviewing all of your objectives for the future to make sure that they're not going to cause problems down the line. Just briefly, my last one on monuments here. The standing stones or various stone-based monuments, as distinct from earthworks. Stone by its nature is fairly durable. It's the monument themselves, the actual fabric of the monument. In many cases, there's not that much threatening them. They're out in the middle of the countryside where air quality isn't as big an issue as it would be on stone monuments in an urban environment, say, where air pollution can cause damage to stonework. The main issue is invariably how to marry the preservation of those upstanding stone monuments in an actively farmed landscape. So you can see in the picture here on the right, you know, an intensive arable field with cultivation very close to the stone. No doubt has probably degraded the archaeological resource that may be around this stone, but ostensibly the stone's still there. It's the it's the upstanding feature, and the damage to the underground archaeology has probably been taking place over the course of many decades or even centuries. There's a slight issue with the close proximity of heavy machinery to the stone, but to date there doesn't appear to have been a whole lot of damage, and you have to balance the fact that this landowner is taking some cognizance of the archaeological monument that they have involuntarily inherited on their land. You can't go too hard on these people, because they are in most cases voluntarily looking after as best they can the archaeological heritage. But there are various schemes and guidance that would give advice to farmers to conserve monuments better. Anyway, when I talk about masonry structures, I'm talking about, as distinct from structures made of earth or just stone on its own. Masonry is where you have stone bound with a lime or clay, or more recently a cement binder. So you have stones with some material in between, which acts to both bind the stone together and hold the structure in place, but also to transfer the structural forces throughout the building. I'm not an engineer, but I've looked at so many of these buildings, and I understand that gravity is the main feature in all of these things, and that's what determines how buildings stay up. There was lots of stuff constructed hundreds of years ago. Lots of it wasn't built very well and has since fallen down. The stuff that we're left with is generally the best of what was there. It was done with the most understanding of how the materials work, and the combination between that and the best siting of the structure. So just when I talk about masonry structures, that's what I'm referring to. So I'm referring to old buildings. They could be, this is part of a kind of a 18th, 19th century plantation site, and I just put it in there to illustrate how nature is always in the process of reclaiming her own. So this is probably a site that would be familiar with a lot of previously unmaintained historic graveyards or historic masonry structures, and we can deal with the issues at play there. Also, my pet favourite is bridges as a masonry structure that generally involves use of locally sourced materials, local stone. So you're not transporting it very far, and it's also inherently appropriate for the local flora and fauna. They're all designed, they've all evolved to deal with surviving on the geology of the area, with the different climatic and environmental conditions in that area. So you've got local stone, you've got local lime. By quick explanation, the lime that is used to bind most historic buildings was sourced from burning limestone in a kiln. You burn it, and then that's mixed with sand and water, very simply to create a mortar that you can use to build structures. You quite often hear maybe people talking about when they're doing repair works or conservation works, natural hydraulic lime and hydraulic lime. And your natural hydraulic lime is probably the most commonly used repair material. It's burnt lime as well, but it's burnt lime with additional clays and other minerals that give it a small degree of a hard set that can be useful. But you just have to be aware that the lime that is used to bed between stones should and always was much softer than the stones that it's bedding itself, and we'll see why that is important later on. As distinct from the like of ordinary Portland cement, which has been around for just over 100 years commercially, and it's burnt limestone, but it has a lot of other additives, burnt at much higher temperature, and it has different properties that make it completely unsuitable for repair of most historic masonry structures. So, as John was saying, this is one example of a local group who incorporated themselves and commissioned some research into the historical background of this. It's a partly medieval up to later medieval stone ruined church in Killybegs in County Donegal, and it's just one that I happen to be involved with, helping them to write the schedule of works based on priority of needs, so that we identified areas on the structure where limited amounts of money could be best coordinated and put towards consolidating and helping to preserve certain areas which were urgently in need of repair. So when we first came here, there was extensive tree growth on and in the walls and adjacent to them that was leading to structural problems that needed to be addressed. So when we identified areas, what I'm going to look at now is work that I completed on this gable end and the two side walls of the north transept of the church. As you can see, and this is very common features here. You've got a lot of ivy, you've got a certain number of trees rooted on the structure, and those are leading to localized structural damage here. We've got a big root of ivy going down here that's actually pushed out the masonry at the corner of this wall. And critically, this is where we looked at where a small amount of masonry here has been completely displaced, but it's on the corner, so it's providing the structural strength to this part of the wall and this other section. So as a compromise, this was removed, the stones numbered and carefully recorded in advance, and then placed back in their original alignment to provide the strength that they were originally providing before being displaced. So generally we try and avoid reconstructing historic structures, but there was you take a balanced view of it. Rebuilding this part helps to save, it's for the greater good.
I presume you needed consent for that?
This was all done, yes, exactly. There was extensive, this was part of a management plan, There was a license applied for, and all of the works that I'm going to show you here were carried out under archaeological supervision. So this, while it's not what I'm suggesting everyone go out and do tomorrow, this is what can result from effective plans, and it was also meant to complement the everyday maintenance that the local group could have carried out. Yes?
More for you.
Was indeed, and I'll go into that as I go through it. But just to point out, the things that I kept on encouraging the local group to do was to maintain the vegetation on the wall tops. Just keep it trimmed back. For this, you don't need any license, and there's no liable damage to the masonry structure. So you're cutting back the ivy or the trees as tight as possible to the masonry without interfering with the masonry and without attempting to remove it, because we'll look at it again, and it's something that causes controversy with local groups who like to get active in removing vegetation, but quite often their enthusiasm can overtake the consideration of the possible consequences. So, for example, a common temptation is to maybe cut the main root of ivy that's growing up over a wall in the hopes that kills it off and it'll just die off itself and fall off. But unfortunately, if the ivy up here is well established, it'll be drawing most of its nutrients and water from the ground, but it will also have small roots in the top of the wall. And what can quite often happen is you cut off the main supply here, it develops much more supply on the wall itself. The roots go deeper and further into the wall and convert the mortar in the core of the wall to soil, and it can be completely dead from the ground up, and then there's this very verdant green fuzz on the top of the wall, which is actually you've doubled or trebled the rate of deterioration of that wall. So just be cautious with that. Anytime you go doing removal or kind of terminal action on vegetation, you need to be ready for whatever masonry consequences there may be. In many cases, the ivy that's growing up over walls is actually binding the loose stone on top together. It's providing the most effective, consolidation, for want of a better term, on the wall. And ultimately, that's not sustainable to be kept there. But if you kill the ivy and this network of branches decays and dies away, the loose stone at the top is going to all start falling off. So you need to be ready to do the masonry consolidation before you've killed off the damaging vegetation. So that's after the works, or the first phase of the works, and you can see this heavy growth of vegetation here had to be cut back. So we first clipped it all back so you could see the rough outline of the structure, and then we found that the entire core here had to be removed in order to pull out all the roots. There's no point in cutting them back at the surface and saying this is cleared of vegetation, because ivy is extremely good at surviving, and it will come back. And equally, I find chemical treatment of them, whatever your views on that, ivy's it's pretty resistant to the vast majority of chemical treatments. As are most woody plants. You can kill off grass and nettles and docks quite easily with Roundup. You can get other treatments for more scrubby material, but ivy in particular, the native species, ivy and ash and hawthorn, they're designed to survive. They're very, very well suited to the conditions in this country, and most chemical treatments have only limited effectiveness and could be potentially damaging to other non-damaging vegetation and to the stone itself. Yes.
Going back to the previous slide there now.
Yes.
I was wondering, would that require a haircut, as you call it?
Exactly, and this is what I was encouraging the group to do. That should, even at this stage, they had trimmed a lot of the trees, but you can see there's regrowth here. This was a full-grown ash tree here on this internal gable. It was trimmed off, but over the course of, there's not any more than 3 or 4 years growth there. And really, to cut a sapling that's that size is much easier than to cut something this size. And over time, that it doesn't take much time for those things to develop. But yeah, if there are means of just keeping this trimmed back, and I would suggest twice a year, even coming in with extended hedge trimmers, with great care, obviously, and under with all the right health and safety gear, because there's a lot of loose stone on this wall top that could be dislodged. But my constant refrain is maintenance, just keeping this trimmed back without touching the structure. You're reducing the leaf content, so there's less. The plant is going to grow slower. You know, there's not as much. It's not gaining as much energy to develop its root system. So if you keep it trimmed back, it's constantly causing decay to the building. But if you can slow that down, it gives you a bit of time to catch up and maybe come along and do the masonry works that were carried out. And again, those masonry works were only carried out on a limited area. This particular group, they obtained funding through the Heritage Council and their own fundraising and the local authority. And they were able to engage me for 2 or 3 weeks in the summertime to come up and generally get burnt, and also to do a bit of consolidation work in previously identified areas of the building. I haven't been back now for a couple of years, but there were other areas that they wanted to tackle that just required much more work than I would have been able to do. They're already quite structurally compromised, and but we managed to conserve a couple of areas of it, so that was worthwhile. So yeah, we're both kind of this is my colleague Peter here, that we kind of obscured the rebuilt corner, but while it's all been there's a contemporary reconstruction there. We've used all the old materials. We've placed it back in, as far as we could tell. We followed the line of the continuous masonry either side here to relocate the corner of the building, and ultimately it's providing a degree of cohesion and structural strength. And then we've consolidated the wall tops. In a way, it's a technique known as roof racking, where you build up not the face stones, because these are the historically significant elements of the original structure, but and anywhere these had to come off, we numbered them, photographed them, and placed them back on where they had to be removed. But for the core, this is built up to create a sort of a domed top on the walls, which makes the main element that destroys buildings, water. It enables it to escape off the wall tops as quickly as possible. Now, there are other techniques. You can cap off the top with a nice concrete capping, or you can make it very even and uniform and put stone slabs on it to prevent the water getting in. But for all of those things, you're putting a permanent fix on something, and you're implying that you know how it was originally finished. Re-straightening walls and improving or enhancing masonry structures, it's entirely subjective thing to be doing, and you could be confusing the historic, the archaeological informational value of this structure. So by just raising the core, it's obvious that this is a later intervention, So, but it still provides the purpose of throwing the water off. So this is just the other side, around the corner there, past the pallets, and this is before we started our work. During the works, and you can see this is the root of a sycamore tree, the entire part of it, which was very carefully and only by hand was basically or exposed. You may be able to make it out here. This tree has just completely digested basically a portion of the wall here. The stones on the wall were actually enveloped in timber, and so recording those is all very well, but you're going to destroy a load of chainsaws getting those out of there to put them back in, and they've been moved, they've been repositioned, so they've really lost their informational value.
Did you take it out?
Just wait and see. Yeah, so we took down stone, and you may be able to make out, we've numbered some of the stones here on the face that may have had to come out, but in the end didn't have to, just on the off chance that if they were to be removed, they could be put back in the same position. That was in the morning, that's in the afternoon. So we just pushed it off. We couldn't get a crane anywhere near here or anything like that, so it was pushed off, and then the local community group came in, and all of their enthusiasm, their destructive enthusiasm, was unleashed on the large block of timber and stone, which, yeah, it allowed release of that pent-up energy in a safe manner. But again, here we've reconstructed this corner. It had been completely pushed out by the stone, and you can see, or by the tree, and you can see it's actually a little bit inside the line of the wall up above here, because this is back where we believed this matches the line of the wall further on. So we haven't tried to repair where it wasn't necessary. These are all large, well tied in stones, and although they've been deflected out a little bit, they're still quite stable, and that's part of the record of how the building has developed over time. But when we're reconstructing here, we're following the same masonry pattern. So the stones are generally horizontal and the joints are well covered, but it's to create a strong point here that will hopefully protect the other parts of the masonry.
Carry out the work yourselves?
Yes. Yeah, just myself and my Czech mason friend from County Sligo. So but that was the very last point in a series of planning and obtaining the funding in sections. So this whole set of work was done in two phases of approximately 4 weeks' work for two people. And like when we came around to this tree, we realised there's another phase here. We can't do all of this in the first part of the job, or I'd be closer to bankrupt than I actually was. So but the local group saw this, and they saw that there had been significant progress made. So they rattled up more buckets and got enough to take us on to the end of this wall. And just a point there that I missed earlier on is that you can see here again. There's a small line here of the original overhanging cornice of this building. Again, it's completely buried in the roots of vegetation, and all of the stones were loose. They could have been taken away very easily. But that is an original reference point of the architectural structure. Excuse me. It gives you information about the original height of the eaves, the original design overhang, the materials even possibly used for the original roof. And while there's no plan to reinstate a roof here, that's conserving that part of the informational value of the structure in place. And you can see when I'd finished, I took particular care to try and keep that in place. So that wasn't altered during the course of works. We had to, like the tree stump was in here, so we did have to reinstate some of these stones, but only where we knew where they came out of. Up at the top here, I couldn't rebuild that because it had been completely, consumed by the tree trunk. So this was just brought up as far as we knew, and then, consolidated with the rough racking process. And that's a view along the top of the walls. So water is directed immediately down. You've got large stones that are supporting the face stones on the outer sides. They're not going to fall off. Too often you see capping often on local authority works on bridges or parapet walls where they put a big lump of mortar, often lime, often the correct product, and then they press small stones into the top as a robust capping. But go back in 2 years' time, half those stones are in the ground, and it's not a traditional or a structurally sound means of capping any wall.
Yeah, we can ask roughly how much did it cost you for the 4 weeks of your
it was probably about 15 or 16,000 was the work that was involved there. Now, part of the reason I'm back writing reports is because I'm not a great businessman when it comes to stone conservation. I usually do the thing far too conscientiously than is commercial, but you're talking in and around that and that was part public funding and part private fundraising. They're manageable sums, and the fact that this was broken off into chunks every year. The works here, there were other parts of the site that were carried out over the course of 5 or 6 years. So there's an ongoing process, and even the fact that it is ongoing, there's activity seen on the site. It's not all finished in one go. That keeps encouraging local interest, and when people come to visit, as they often do in this area, they can see that the site has been actively managed.
Sorry, were you commissioned by the local voluntary group?
Yes, I was. Yeah, I tendered for the work and obtained it.
But did they helped? Did they chop away at the tree? We'd say
yeah, they were maintaining the vegetation on the top, but not as much as was constantly advising them. But that's something they could have helped doing. Yeah.
And that is something that can be done.
It's something that it should be done in conjunction with conducting some sort of a management plan for the site.
I was just add to that, and we were involved just kind of early, and Eamonn came into it at that stage, is that again, as Mary was be conscious that they had got consent to do work. The main thing that the group started on is the clearance of the light vegetation within the graveyard, because at one stage it was fairly inaccessible. And they started with that, and then as they came to the church, a bit like the other group we talked about, they realised this was something that's too big for them. But it is a community group, and they got their consents from first of all from Donegal County Council, because in that instance Donegal County Council owned the site, just like the sites in Cork County Council would be the guardian or the owner, and they did a certain amount of work themselves, but they realised this was too big. It was very beneficial. One chap was involved in it, he did a lot of masonry work himself, and he looked at it and said this was going to be a problem. So it was a person who realised the limitations of their own group, and that's when they pulled in a bit of expertise.
Yeah.
But they did, and they had a fall scheme as it was then to keep maintaining, and they did a lot of work on the boundary walls. But for something like this, they knew that you needed to get approval.
Yeah.
And
approval, and in many cases you need scaffolding, and it's quite a
problem, like we'd say with here in Clonakilty with the old Kilgareth graveyard, not the one that you showed there now, is that we have a plan.
Yes.
We want to go in there, but the county council won't let us in there. And right, Mary? Yeah. And we want to move it on.
Well, it's just that they won't let you in there, but it's just that they won't let you in there.
Yeah.
It's the trees.
It's the trees, yeah. So we have to get the trees cut.
Yeah.
Well, the council have said they will cut the trees, but they're not happening. It's not happening.
The difference between trees and light material growing on walls is you can maintain the light material, but the trees are going to need further consideration, as you can see, because you can cut them off, and there's danger associated with that. These are perched up on a wall. It's an entirely, unstable environment for them to be growing anyway. So you just have to be conscious of the health and safety risks.
Can I just clarify that maintenance doesn't require you to get consent or notifications to the department. Works.
Yeah.
Anything requires works. Hard to define what works is, with digging at walls, all that. With kind of clipping and clearing.
So it's saying cutting back to the masonry without touching it that's maintenance.
So that doesn't.
So are you saying, Mary, that we can go into Kilgareth?
Well, with the permission of Cork County Council, I'm saying no. The notification, archaeology is protected by the National Monuments Act, and that's a state agent under the Department of Culture, Heritage and Development. They're the responsible people, not the county council. They're the people who are responsible, who you need to get permission for any works to an archaeological.
We have that permission.
Oh, I know. I can't address that straight away. That's a municipal district issue, and I will work with you on that. But I'm just clarifying that maintenance doesn't require, but works do.
In the situation when you did, you're an archaeologist yourself, right?
No, I'm just a building consultant, but I was accompanied by archaeologists on this.
Is the person has a good knowledge of stonework?
That's a subjective assessment. There are lots of people who do stonework, and the majority of it's stone facing, and they don't understand the means of historic stone conservation. Like my colleague Owen will elucidate that an awful lot of the work, the repair work that's been done today, is undoing the inappropriate repairs of the last 30 to 40 years by people who were classed mainly by themselves as stonemasons. There are very, very few stonemasons in this country, but I'm not a stonemason. I don't claim to be an expert, but what I did in that case was take it down very carefully, observe how it was built, and then put it back in as close to the same way.
Stalls and how things are taken down.
Yeah, and like I want to move on, but like my colleague there is an expert stonemason, and I was mainly involved in trying to tone down the quality of his work, because he was trying to improve this historic structure. It's been there a long time. There are flaws in it. It wasn't constructed to an ideal standard, but it had been there, and we weren't trying to improve on it. We had to try and just consolidate what was there and conserve it. Anyway, we'll move on to graveyards, because I want to quickly have a look at those. There's this is a historic graveyard that shows a range of monument types, and as John was saying, most of the upstanding stones and monument types here with a bit of wrought iron railing around this one, those are all 19th century or late 18th century in some cases insertions in a graveyard that probably predates that considerably. The majority of uncut stone markers and just simple mounds that follow a roughly linear pattern. They're all relatively aligned in the same direction. This is the sort of feature you come across in many historic graveyards, as distinct from the more modern municipal graveyards, where it's a very level surface with very uniform grid plan to enable wheelchair access in many cases. But this is a different environment.
Eamonn, you might tell your audience the difference between a graveyard and a cemetery.
I have no idea.
No?
Nope. So we'll deal with that one later. I suppose it's an enclosure of burials. So you're not just dealing with the memorials themselves, the interments. You're dealing with the boundary wall. You're dealing with quite often a ruined structure, possibly an old church structure, and a whole range of different monument types, from the uncarved stone markers, unmarked graves. You've got flat ground bedded slabs. You've got upright headstones. You've got the remnants of a sort of a chest tomb there, where it's built up in a mound. I wouldn't be qualified to define what a cemetery is. I'm afraid I have to look up the dictionary, but I may give you the chance to do that later on. This was my initial slide to do with the means of maintenance in this graveyard is done primarily by enabling the local farmers' sheep to graze on the graveyard itself. Now, whether by accident or design, they're encroaching from the surrounding pasture. This is a very rural landscape. There's no town around here, and it's all enclosed from the public road. So the sheep are able to get in, and they're able to graze the undulations and the stones poking up through the ground without causing any major damage, and much more effectively, and with a lot less damage than a lawnmower or a set of streamers. And they do it for free generally. So you can just see how in this case, I felt that it was probably the most effective and the most likely means of maintaining the ground for reasonable public access on a very sloped, undulating site with a great number of obstacles for killing lawnmowers. Again, there's no like this graveyard isn't in regular modern use, but there would still be interest from particularly people coming back to visit the area to wander through it, and that was a means of providing that continuous access. This is another alternative means of keeping graveyards maintained. Again, this is another old graveyard, but with a modern graveyard attached, and spraying off using biocides, using herbicides, Roundup, whatever, is a means of maintaining the land. But there are numerous negatives to this, not least, apart from all the ecological benefits of maintaining a green cover. once this is bare soil, it's very prone to erosion. So you can see along the paths here where the water is coming off the paths, it's turning that into muck, and that just gets washed away. So over time you're losing the top surface of the ground that would otherwise be held by the grassy surface. So.
What about the growth afterwards on that?
Regrowth after this is unlikely to be nice, easily maintained perennial ryegrass. It's going to be docks and thistles and nettles that are A, unsightly, B, noxious weeds that are meant to be controlled, and they don't provide the same sort of binding of the ground surface. So, in general, it's a practice to be avoided, and there are means there are alternatives to application of herbicide that I can look at. I'm not going to really go into this. This is a section on bronze that's the main details of it will be dealt with by Pat later in the afternoon. But it's a lot of the issues that affect bronze or ironwork are the same as what affects stonework. It's mainly the ingress of water and in urban areas the problem of air pollution.
Well, I suppose, Eamonn, there's no harm. Just as you're speaking on, like the current climate change that's on at the moment.
Yeah, the current round, yes.
Probably very serious snowfalls, probably very serious weather conditions.
Yeah.
And we find that even we cast on our lands at home now, and it's one wall cast with a big huge turret on the side of it, and there's a massive big gap has opened up in the middle of it.
Yeah,
over the last 4 years to 5 years when the
a lot of cases from frost damage. When water gets in, freezes, expands, and that's happening. Like there are waves of severe frost damage like that, irrespective of the major climate change that's undoubtedly underway. But it's action like that freeze thaw action that undermines a lot of the kind of modern solutions to things. So, like for example, I was asked the other day about putting sealants on a gravestone to help preserve the inscripted character of the outer surface. And what sealants do is they kind of impregnate the outer surface and consolidate that, make it more impervious to water. But you're basically sealing up this surface. Water can get down in behind it, and through freeze thaw action, you can lose that entire surface off the stone, either in bits or in one big sheet. So it's interfering with the natural operation of the stone or the metalwork can have profound consequences. Again, wrought iron. I'll let Pat deal with that. So vegetation on and around monuments can be problematic, as in the case of this yew. It's actually probably not a yew tree. It's more likely to be a cypress or some other more vigorous evergreen tree, which has pretty much enveloped that 19th century headstone. Again, yew is traditionally in historic graveyards because it's very slow growing. It's evergreen, so it doesn't produce vast quantities of leaf and twig material. But other items such as this wall rue and the vast array of lichens and mosses that you get on historic walls and structures aren't issues that you need to be concerned about. Whatever minimal amount of damage that these species are doing is infinitesimally smaller than the damage required to remove them. So it's been a recurring theme is how do we remove lichen from headstones, and my advice, and it's a free country, you can do what you like, my advice is not to remove them because you're going to cause more damage, and my colleague Owen will show you the level of damage that can be caused by the most effective removal of lichen, which is with an angle grinder. And you laugh, but it happens all over the place. It's causing the loss of an awful lot of great art that was put there by Irish craftspeople. So there's an example of a wall. It's very dark, but of where ivy has taken over this structure. Now it's still a fairly solid structure, but the opportunity here would be for a local group to trim that back. Just reduce the leaf quantity, so that you're reducing the vigor that this ivy is growing with. You're also you could, like with care, remove any overhanging branches and remove that sail effect that this whole mass of leaf here is catching the wind and placing potentially structural pressure on the wall. The temptation to cut all these roots here, as I described earlier, may be effective, but it also may remove the network of tendrils at the top that are holding loose stones in place, and it may also promote the creation of more extensive root systems in the wall. So you can accelerate damage by doing that.
If you examine the wall and the wall is pretty sound on the top and everything, it might be okay to...
Certainly, yeah. But you just, and like I was doing extensive removal of ivy and trees, but I was there with scaffolding, I was there with the mixer and with the lime that we were discussing, and that was all ready to go for unforeseen. You can look at it, stand back and look at a wall, but until you're up there trying to lift the stones out, you don't know how consolidated it is. And you could be lifting 1 or 2 stones off, or you could end up lifting 50 stones off. And that's the difference between 2 and 3, 4 or 5,000. So you need to be ready to go ahead and do that work before you remove the vegetation. So there's your yew. I explained about that. It's long associated with graveyards, long-lived, and that native species generally toxic to most grazing animals, so it encouraged local farmers to maintain the boundaries and keep their livestock out of there. The sheep that were grazing in and around it in my previous example didn't seem all that bothered, but usually if there's enough grass, animals don't go near a tree that they know is not good for them. And I certainly didn't see too many carcasses of unfortunate sheep who had eaten a yew berry. They are a good source of food and habitat for bird species. But here is a case where sycamore has started off very small saplings. It's an extremely effective propagator, not a native tree species, but it gets in there, and within 5 years, where it would be very easily removed, it quickly gets up. This is no more probably than 30 or 40 years old. These branches here, and they've probably been cut in the past, and that's why they've come up in multiple stems. But it just shows how cutting is one thing, but you need to cut and then remove the roots. Japanese knotweed, just don't touch it, lads, just don't touch it. It's a specialist thing to remove, and it's particularly common around watercourses and along roadways. Not so much maybe in graveyards, but there are cases where people have brought it in to decorate graves, and that's another issue with importing species into graveyards. It can have unintended consequences. That was just an information section on the lichen that is on. It seems it's not well understood. I am by no means an ecologist on lichen, but all of the splodges here that can be seen, the whites and the browns, and there's oranges and greens. There could be up to 100 different species of lichen, which is a plant. It's a cross between a fungus and an algae that specializes in colonizing stone, and it's particularly good at colonizing stone from this area. So all the limestones that would be from the local area, the sandstone, it colonizes those and adds a dimension of natural heritage. There could be up to 100 different species of individual lichen species in this one graveyard, with different species on this side of the stone, different species on the other side, depending how much sun they get. They're an indicator of very clean air, some of them. And the damage they cause to the stone, as I said, it's much less than the damage caused by the removal. So your tips for ground maintenance and trimming: consider waiting until April after the first flush of dandelion. I can stop at any point, but these are the issues that came up. This is a means of not only kind of enhancing the natural heritage of graveyards, but also of ultimately saving you money and work. If you go in there and you're mowing the grass regularly, nice and tight, you're promoting more and more verdant grass to come back, and you have that ongoing commitment then to keep it trimmed, which might be fine for this year or next year. You don't know in 10 years down the line if there's going to be the same level of enthusiasm. So doing two cuts during the year, full cuts. So consider waiting until April after the first flush of dandelions to feed the pollinators, and then cut the lot, and in the summer allow the grass to grow, perhaps, this is a suggested method, allow it to grow long, but cut paths through, well time-proven routes around the graveyard. And this also helps to show that it's not just been abandoned. You've got a maintained zone, and then into another area of richer natural heritage that you can stray into, but at your own peril, because there could be lots of hidden trip hazards. And it's another useful thing, along a strimmed path, do a small verge, maybe half a metre either side, so you can see that transition from the managed area, the managed zone, into the place that's been allowed to go wild. And then your second cut in September, you remove, the important thing is to remove all the grass cuttings, because that, over time, as you're removing all that material, you're reducing the nutritional levels in the soil, and you end up getting more of the wildflowers, the less vigorous plant growth over time, and that is reducing your work level. It's increasing the number of butterflies and other food sources for pollinators, but it is reducing your work. And yeah, avoid contact with stones or trees with strimmers. Really, there's no need to go so close. I haven't really covered that section in graffiti previously, but it's usually the problem with graffiti. It's on areas where there are major problems. Vegetation is probably a small problem if you've got problems with antisocial behaviour. So generally go and find a graveyard that doesn't have graffiti or drug taking or other things going on. But we can go through some of the maintenance do's and don'ts. So do create a plan. All right, as John has been hammering home, it's important that you can harness that enthusiasm that moves into your graveyard. It's maybe enthusiastic now, but you need to be able to direct it in an effective manner. Regularly trim damaging vegetation, not big jungle clearance. This is just trimming damaging vegetation. Again, that's not the lichen, it's not the small ferns, it's the ivy, overgrowth, and brambles away from masonry structures. Just trim them back without removing it or contacting the masonry. Record the site regularly, even if you just stand at the gate and take the same picture every 6 months. That, over time, that builds up a record that you can see things happening that you wouldn't see just by walking in there. And it's something I always do when I'm working on a site. I take the same picture, and you can see where the improvements, where any missed areas that have to be maintained are. You don't need any consent for that record keeping, and it can be done with virtually no expertise that are specialist. Consult then specialist advice where you want to develop your plan. You may have masonry expertise, you may have ecological or archaeological expertise on your group, and that can all be brought to bear, but don't just plough on with work without incorporating that in an approved plan that will be approved by either the local authority or the National Monument Service. And then you need to provide information and training of all these things to any CE scheme workers or local volunteers that are coming in, so that they don't inadvertently cause damage. Don't carry out any works without considering the immediate and subsequent effects. It's very simple to say, but it's all over the place. People who only think in the moment and don't consider what the later effects might be. Don't cut the ivy at ground level until you're ready, until you've got the scaffolding and the wherewithal, the expertise, the masonry materials ready to carry out any necessary repairs. You need to use appropriate materials and techniques when repairing. I know you'd asked about the use of lime and stuff. If we get a chance later on, and Owen actually covers a bit on lime, but I'm just trying to rattle through other more general concepts. Don't carry out any excavation on any recorded archaeological site before seeking advice, and that would have to be done under license. So even if it's very, very localized ground reduction to put in scaffolding, that is interference with an archaeological site. And graveyards tend to be full of bone and other things, so you'll know very, very quickly. So just keep away from the ground surface. That would include, I was asked earlier about about stripping of topsoil to plant slow-growing grass varieties, and that's interference with the grass or with the soil structure. I'll come back to you in 1 second, and you're going to bring up many more problems than you'll solve. And don't start with the biggest conservation project. Don't decide, oh, we're going to put a roof in this room. Look at areas where you can practically deal with them. There are a few resources there, but I believe these presentations will be available later on. And if anyone wants to know anything about stonework or masonry, I would definitely point you in the direction of Irish Stone Walls by Patrick McPhee, who I've worked with over the years. And it just provides a very simple and very easy to understand, but very effective understanding of how masonry structures perform and how they should be maintained. So
Thank you.
I can go on and on, but I think we're